All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to explore a really powerful and, let's be honest, provocative critique of the modern state. It's an argument that comes straight from libertarian political philosophy, and it's designed to challenge the very foundations of government, asking some pretty uncomfortable questions about power, obedience, and morality. So, let's get into it.
So, here's what we're going to cover. We'll kick things off with a single question that frames this entire critique. From there, we'll look at a key distinction in how wealth is created, or taken. Then we'll tackle the big puzzle of why people obey, how the state manufactures our consent, and the absolutely crucial role intellectuals play in that process. And we'll wrap it all up with a final, stark comparison that brings the whole argument into sharp focus.
Okay, so let's get right to the heart of the matter. The source material we're looking at today doesn't just want us to think about how to create a better government. No, it wants us to take a step back and ask what government is at its most basic level. And it starts with the state's most fundamental power, the power of taxation.
And here it is. This is the question that kicks the whole thing off. The source is really challenging us to draw a clear moral line here. I mean, think about it. If a private gang demanded your money and threatened you with force if you didn't pay up, we'd all call that robbery, right? So the question is, when the state does the exact same thing, what makes it different?
Now, this idea isn't new. It was put into these really stark terms by the 19th century thinker Lysander Spooner. He argues that the government's action is actually worse than a common robber's. Why? Because the highwayman doesn't pretend to be your protector. He doesn't claim to have a legitimate right to your property. For Spooner, it's the hypocrisy, the way the state wraps its coercion in the language of legitimacy that makes it so much more shameful.
All right, so that very provocative question leads us into a much broader framework for how to understand the state itself. To get there, the source material asks us to first wrap our heads around a really fundamental idea, that there are only two ways human beings can get wealth.
To explain this, the analysis brings in the work of a sociologist named Franz Oppenheimer. He's the one who coined this term, the political means. Now, what's really interesting here is how simple this idea is. This isn't about party politics like Democrats or Republicans. Nope. This is about the raw act of getting wealth, not by creating it, but by forcibly taking it from the people who did.
And this slide just lays out the two paths perfectly. On one side, you have the economic means. This is the world of production, innovation, voluntary exchange, the free market, where people trade with each other because both sides hope to come out ahead. And on the other side, you have the political means, coercion, expropriation, taking without asking. One path is productive. The other, according to this argument, is parasitic.
And here is where it all clicks into place. If you follow Oppenheimer's logic, then the state is simply the ultimate expression of the political means. It's not just random, sporadic robbery like a common criminal might commit. No, it is the systematic organization of predation over a given territory. In this view, the state is the system that legally allows one group of people to live off the production of another group.
The political theorist John C. Calhoun took this idea and ran with it. As our source highlights, he argued that this simple act of taxing people and spending that money automatically, inevitably splits society into two classes. You have the taxpayers, the people who, on the whole, pay more into the system than they get out, and then you have the tax consumers, the people who, on net, live off of that system. And according to Calhoun, these two groups are locked in a permanent, built-in conflict with each other.
So this brings us to a really fascinating puzzle. I mean, if the state is really just an organization based on coercion and predation, as this argument claims, how has it survived for so long? Why don't the masses, who are always vastly more numerous than the rulers, just stand up and say, no more?
This is the great mystery of civil obedience. It's a question that the famous philosopher David Hume thought a lot about. He was just amazed by it. He couldn't get over the fact that the many are governed by the few, and that people just seem to submit to their rulers. It's a question that cuts right to the very foundation of political power.
The answer, according to our source, is actually quite simple: consent. Every single government, from the most brutal dictatorship you can imagine to the most freewheeling democracy, ultimately rests on the support of the majority of its people. Now, and this is key, that support doesn't have to be enthusiastic cheering in the streets. It can be, and usually is, just passive resignation. You know, that feeling behind the old saying, nothing is certain except death and taxes.
Okay, so if getting that majority acceptance is the whole ballgame, the next big question is, how is it done? How do rulers convince a majority of people to either actively support their rule or, at the very least, just passively accept it? Well, this section of our source material lays out the entire ideological toolkit.
And according to this analysis, rulers have built up a pretty sophisticated arsenal over the centuries. They appeal to tradition. This is how it's always been done. They create fear of any alternative. They use nationalism to get everyone to rally around the state. And critically, they try to make people feel guilty for their own individual success, all while devaluing the individual in favor of the collective.
Let's just zoom in on nationalism for a second, because the source calls this a particularly successful trick. The goal is to basically merge the identity of the state with the identity of the people and the land itself. It's a clever move. That way, your natural patriotism, your love for your home and community, gets co-opted. A war between two governments is reframed as an attack on us, and so people rush to defend their masters, mistakenly believing that their masters are actually defending them.
And this fantastic quote from H.L. Mencken just nails why the state has to do all this ideological work. An independent thinker is a threat. Because if you actually think things through for yourself, you might start to see the coercion behind the curtain of legitimacy. And that's why, the source argues, the state has a deep, deep interest in discouraging critical thought and promoting ideas that just reinforce its own power.
So, who are the people actually crafting and spreading these state-friendly ideologies? The source is very clear. The state does not do this alone. It relies on a crucial ally, forming what the analysis calls the state's most important partnership of all.
This relationship is presented as a classic quid pro quo, a trade. The state desperately needs intellectuals to shape public opinion and to give its rule this aura of legitimacy, of wisdom, of being scientific and inevitable. But what's in it for the intellectuals? Why do they need the state?
Well, the argument here is pretty blunt. In a truly free market, an intellectual's success depends entirely on the voluntary choices of ordinary people. And let's be real, the masses are generally not lining up to buy books on abstract philosophical ideas. The state, on the other hand, the state can offer what the market might not: a guaranteed income, a stable job in the state bureaucracy, and the huge prestige that comes with being an official expert.
And this example from the text is just so revealing. There was this scholar, Joseph Needham, who was apparently outraged that someone criticized the despotism of ancient China. And why? Because that despotic system was one that put scholars and poets into positions of power. The source uses this to show that for some intellectuals, the appeal of official status and power can totally outweigh any concerns about the nature of the state they serve.
And don't think for a second this is just ancient history. The source brings this argument right into the modern day. It points to the rise of this whole professional class of unelected national security managers and policy experts. These are the modern-day court intellectuals who argue that things like foreign policy and economics are just too complex for the public to understand. The job of the masses, even in a democracy, is just to trust the experts and rubber stamp their decisions.
And that brings us right back to where we started. After digging into the state's nature, the mystery of why people obey, and its deep alliance with intellectuals, the source returns to its core idea with one final bracing comparison.
This quote from Albert J. Nock just perfectly sums up the entire critique we've been walking through today. The argument is that the state doesn't actually eliminate crime. It monopolizes it. It tells individuals they can't steal and they can't kill, but then it reserves the exclusive right to do both of those things on a massive scale, just under different names like taxation and war. It places itself completely above the moral law that it forces on everyone else.
So we end with this final question for you to really think about. This is the ultimate takeaway from this whole analysis. What does it actually mean for our society and for our own sense of morality if the biggest, most powerful institution in our lives operates by a totally different set of rules than you and I are expected to? The source material just leaves that question hanging in the air, forcing us to confront the very moral logic at the heart of the state. Thanks for exploring this challenging idea with us today.